Your stories don't define you. How you tell them will. Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, your host and Chief Story Maker of Elkins Consulting. We share stories for many reasons, to persuade, to entertain, and to connect. But what we sometimes forget is the impact of the stories we tell ourselves. Whether you're sharing personal stories or business stories, how you share them makes a difference in how you remember them and in how you're being perceived by the people you're interacting with. In this series, you'll hear stories that will resonate with you and you'll nod your head in understanding. And then we'll dig into lessons from those stories. When I'm working with clients, I remind them to listen for understanding, not necessarily to respond. But during this podcast, I'm asking you to listen, to consider your related stories, and to consider which stories in your life might have impacted you in a similar way. Today's guest is Shelley Brown, and I hope you'll find her just as entertaining as I have always found her. Welcome to the podcast, Shelley Brown. I'm so happy to have you here today to record this with me. So let's just jump right in. We met on LinkedIn years ago, as at least 3 or 4, maybe more years ago. And the posts that always come back to my head, the first one that pops into my head is the naked post, where you implied physically naked, but it was all about writing naked and really being vulnerable. And I love that piece. So that's part of why I asked you to be on this podcast. But another part of it is that there are some themes that we've had in our conversations offline about how our stories impact the path we take and how sometimes we figure out that those stories may not have contributed to our well-being. We took these paths because of these stories from our youth, and now we're realizing that they didn't really match who we are and what our needs really are. But let's start with the question I always ask my guests. I'd love for you to share something about yourself that people generally don't know about you, that you wouldn't see on your LinkedIn profile or on your resume, and people who you work with generally day-to-day wouldn't know about you.
Well, thanks for asking. I have written several hundred short stories or vignettes, to be more specific, under the moniker Weird Girl, because I think that being weird is not a negative at all. I think it's about being unique and being authentic and being a little bit different, but true to yourself. So I've written more observational stories that take usually funny twists and turns, but also send kind of a heartfelt message about struggles that everybody has, and they're relatable whether you are 20 or you're 75. So that's something that most people wouldn't know, that I write these weird girl stories.
Oh, I love that. And you did share a couple of those with me, and they are hilarious and very insightful. And they definitely color the way that I think about you and what you do and who you are, and in a positive way, partly because they're so creative, but partly because of the way that you write. You are obviously thinking about your childhood a lot and the specific incidents that kind of shaped who you are. Like the one about camping, having a camper and driving to Hawaii somehow, which of course would be impossible. How old were you? 8 in that story?
Oh, probably somewhere.
That was hilarious. I love that. And I think most of us have those ideas in our heads when we're 8 about what we want to do, especially because we have these make-believe toys that allowed us to live these really interesting lives in our imaginations. So that said, you have kind of a history of choosing jobs that pay well, but that don't satisfy you. And we've talked about this in our offline conversations. So what I'd like to do today is dig into some of the stories that you think may have created that dynamic in your head, that you've selected jobs that aren't necessarily fulfilling, that aren't going to really help you learn who you are and grow. So do you have some stories in your head that you could share with us about that?
Sure, and it's funny because we're coming up on Mother's Day, and I had wrote a story called Feminism, Fascination, and False Eyelashes about my mom. And I'm not ashamed to say I'm 54 years old. And the time when I grew up was a really kind of interesting time. There were very, very few working women that I knew of. The only working mother in the neighborhood. In fact, she got kicked out of her mahjong club because she wasn't giving it her personal attention. So here's my mother, who's like this larger-than-life businesswoman traveling on planes. People thought she was a flight attendant. And I'm this kid watching the Brady Bunch and the Partridge Family, expecting, you know, women to be like that, like my friends' moms, who were home when they got home, who had treats for us when we got home. So very confusing female role model messages to me. And here I am, this little girl who loves coloring and drawing fashion designs and pouring through House Beautiful and playing guitar and listening to John Denver and doing everything that's like extremely creative, but I didn't have creative parents. So the message to me was, not only do you have to be, you know, beautiful and everything has to look great on the outside, but you have to be superwoman as well. And I don't think in my young mind, I knew how to translate being the kind of creative kid that I was with being superwoman.
So tell me something specific, an incident with your mom that that you look back now and you're like, oh, that was very telling about our relationship and who I am now.
Well, the first thing that I remember, you know, when I thought about this was when I was bartending after college, and I mean cocktail waitressing after college. I literally still did not know what direction to take. And I just remember her yelling at me, "You cannot be a cocktail waitress. You need to do something. You need to get a job. You just graduated college and you've got to do something." So that was a really strong message, like, oh, I got to do something. And then another message, you know, from both of them was, if you don't make a certain amount of money, you're not going to be in our circle of friends, which I had no clue what that meant to me at that time. But obviously it had a huge impact because I still remember it.
Wow. So when was this a constant conversation while you were cocktailing, or was there one in particular that you remember vividly?
I think it was constant. It was, you know, my daughter is not going to be a college graduate cocktail waitress thing.
So did you have an experience like with her friends that topic came up in front of people?
No, not really. I mean, it's funny because a lot of her friends didn't end up being like her, did not end up being career women like her. Some of them did, but a lot of them didn't.
So she was an anachronism herself.
Yeah. I mean, she had certain ideas of what she wanted me to be, but they were not necessarily what I wanted to be. You know, she wanted me to be a teacher, or I don't know what else, but a teacher was always the thing that she wanted me to be, and I didn't want to do that.
You know, the reason that I ask for these specific stories is that I always have some, like in my head, very vivid memories that at the time I didn't realize were having such an impact on my choices and my path. So for instance, at our house, money was always a question. It was always part of the energy in our house, even if we didn't talk about it. For instance, I would be wearing my brother's hand-me-down Levi's because my parents would give the impression that we couldn't really afford to buy me new jeans. But we always lived in a really nice house, and my dad always drove a nice car. So there was a kind of a conflict in my head about what it meant to not have money. How do you reconcile that as a kid? So I remember sitting at our dining room table, and my brother, both of my siblings are brilliant. And my brother also was an actor, and we all were performers. We all sang. But my brother was always the one that was like holding all of the expectations for my dad. And I remember sitting around the dining room table, and some of our conversations at dinner would be, well, when Eric is rich and famous And he'll have a jet, a private jet. And my dad would then be the one that would get his pilot's license so that he could fly my brother's jet around. I mean, these were the conversations we had at the dinner table. When Eric is rich and famous, that was the conversation. And it kind of colored what I thought of as success, because that's how my dad and brother kind of created a narrative of success. And by the way, none of us have private jets. None of us had my dad as a private jet pilot. And unfortunately, we lost him a few years ago. So he hasn't been able to see some of the great successes that we've had as his children. But it colored things for me. And it wasn't until maybe about 5 years before he died that we had conversations, real conversations about what success looked like to him at that point, which was very different from where it was when he was my age now in his 40s. And so that's why I ask you, because I know that those conversations you had with your mother and those specific instances were the things that colored why you choose jobs now that aren't necessarily good fits for you.
That definitely rings true for me. And you remind me of something really quick that I'll interject is, as a kid, this creativity, I think they were kind of like, oh yeah, Shelley plays guitar. Shelley, is creative and she likes John Denver and she likes her little stuff that she does, but they didn't take it really seriously. So I think, that my sister was the brilliant one and she was going to go on to do great things. And I was kind of the pretty one and I was going to, get married and have somebody take care of me. And the funny thing is now all my creativity, my mother thinks is just really powerful and really amazing. But it was the narrative. It really was.
So tell me about a recent job that was one of those aha moments that you were in the wrong place.
Oh my gosh. So I had spent some time really trying to hone in on what I wanted for my next job, which was my last job. And I had written every day that what I was looking for. I was looking for a sense of community, a work family, a place where my gifts and talents would be really, really welcome, and where I would feel just this strong sense of connection, because I had worked virtual for many years and felt like that, what was it, Maslow's law of connection, where the monkey's put in the cage and there's a rag and the monkey thinks the rag is his mom because there's no affection. I can't remember the name of the experiment.
Part of you're kind of mixing the two different studies, but that's Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah.
And the study about the monkey not choosing the wire mother that fed him and choosing the mother with the soft covering that didn't have food.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. So so that's what I was looking for, that warm covering at a job. And anyway, so there were a few different red flags, and the first of which is I sent a thank you card, a handwritten thank you card with a photograph that I had taken to the recruiter and to the person that would be my manager. And the recruiter put it on her desk. She thought it was lovely. She couldn't believe, I'd taken that photo and thought it was beautiful. Manager never acknowledged it. So that was one. And then two, she had mentioned about needing to go to the Apple store to get her iPhone fixed. Nobody likes that. Nobody likes to go to the Apple store unless you're buying something, right? But to get things fixed, it's like a nightmare. So I had written a story called Issues, which was small S, capital A, small I, capital S. And I sent it to her about, my experience at that Apple store. Never acknowledged it. Then there was a contest, like a call volume contest, like whoever could win, whoever made the most phone calls would get a gift certificate. And I won, but then I was later told that this was for the more junior people. So long story short, no matter how I tried to connect with this person, I was there was no connection whatsoever. And it wasn't only me, it was basically with a lot of people felt the same way. There just was no connecting. And I just can't have that in a relationship, in a work environment, or any relationship. Like, if there's no connection and it's somebody that you're around 40 plus hours a week, I couldn't do it.
So what you're saying is that it's not so much about the work you were doing, because you were finding some satisfaction in that. It was way more environmental.
It was that. I think it was the whole environment. I was thinking that an association would be that soft cloth kind of thing. I don't know why. That's just what I thought. But it turned out to be pretty bureaucratic. And honestly, the work was somewhat fulfilling because I love building relationships with customers. I mean, I love it. And even though they weren't in front of me, they were on the phone. I was doing what I do best, which is cultivating those relationships and finding out areas of opportunity to make somebody's life or business more successful.
That's interesting. I'm remembering some of the conversations we've had in the past about that, about those stories that we've had from our past that kind of lead us into what we know we want in our jobs, but end up kind of choosing the wrong ones for the wrong reasons. So why do you think you picked that job? Did you just need a job, or were you more picky that time?
No, I think that I had wanted something to look like I wanted it to look. And I don't think that I did as good of a job vetting it as I would now. I had taken so much time to write about this, to write about what I wanted, and I saw a few matches, but I think that I didn't do enough. But the other thing is, it's like dating. You could go on a dating site and think somebody is everything that they say they are. You go on the first couple of dates and you're like, oh, wow, this has potential. But then all of a sudden something turns, or they say something that really shows who they authentically are. And then you're like, okay, the things that I thought about this are not really what I thought. And it's the same with jobs. I mean, things can look really good, like those first few dates. But then when you get in deep, they're not always what they say they are. And honestly, I feel like I am somebody who does represent myself authentically. So I could be something that people want, but they may not always represent themselves authentically, which is interesting in the career world, because I'm sure there's plenty of times where candidates don't represent themselves authentically, and then the business gets a fraud.
Right.
But then
that happens all the time.
Yeah. But the job seeker can also get the fraud from the company too.
Yes. That has happened to me on more than one occasion, for sure. My sister calls it sending your agent. When you're in those first few dates, you're not really you. You're sending your agent the best version of you, or the version of you that you think that person is looking for. And that makes a lot of sense. There are some of us that don't do that. And I don't know if it's because we can't send an agent. We just don't have the capacity to be that person that's sending an agent, or if it's because we choose not to. Is it intentional? I think as we age, it changes. So I'd love to hear another story about maybe a job that you had, or a situation that actually you got to shine because you got to show off that creative side of you.
Sure. So I would say between 2007 and 2011, I worked for a company and had the best mentor. And the way I define mentor is somebody whose way of being you want to emulate and you remember. So I had this incredible mentor who had just such a great way about him. I was selling a technology solution, and the way he would talk to people, he would make things so approachable that people are like, wow, I can't believe you just explained that to me and I get it. So he was always somebody that I wanted to emulate. But besides being a great manager and a great mentor, he was an amazing collaborator. So we would partner very well together. And he was very open to my creativity and my creative ways of selling. So, even though it's not writing stories or making art, it's creating relationships that are sustainable, creating relationships that are based on trust, creating relationships that make clients feel important. For example, a pharmaceutical company that I closed, they were not an enterprise multi-million-dollar company, but I invited them to be on our customer advisory board so that they could be involved in making decisions, even though they were a small fish in a big pond. And that's what sealed the deal from the competition. So it was a great kudo, but it was also a chance for me to make something, give them something unique, give them a unique opportunity that I created.
Mm-hmm. And your mentor, your boss at the time, really encouraged you to do that because he understood how you built relationships and why that was so important, right?
Yeah, he did, and he's still in my life, and I call him my person because he's definitely a go-to when it comes to just friendship and business. Mm-hmm. I think having a mentor has been a life changer. So,
do you have any vivid memories of him, of something that happened with him that really struck you?
I have lots of memories. Just every time he lives in California and I live in Chicago, but every time we would get together at a conference or sales meeting, it just was always just the best time. It's like we were good friends and great business partners.
And do you remember any specific times at one of those that makes you laugh?
I think the first time I met him, he had hired me sight unseen, and I flew to Montreal to a conference. And do you remember the woman that had all those kids? She had like 8 kids, and her name was Kate or something like that.
The TV show, the reality TV show.
Yeah.
Yes.
So anyway, at the time I was running a lot, and I guess I had that hair that was like up in the back like Kate. And he's like, "You're in such a hurry. You're always running. Your hair's in a hurry too." And he said it was like Kate from that TV program. But
That's
he always
funny.
called me. I know, he had a nickname for me that stuck, and he still calls me DT, which is downtown Shelley Brown, because he never knew anyone that came from downtown Chicago. And his name is Dan, so I always called him D-Man. So to this day, all these years later, it's DT and D-Man.
I like that. That's fun.
Yeah.
I think sometimes when you get a nickname like that from somebody that sticks like that, it definitely changes your relationship with that person.
For sure.
Interesting. So do you think that that some of what you've experienced in these last few years of misfits in your career, can you see how they might change how you select your next job?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that some of my choices were ego and paycheck driven. Mm-hmm. I never wanted to take less money than the job before. They were ego driven based on title. And at this time, I think my priorities have shifted much more to be focused on not a job to make sure that the job that I take is not going to be so velocity driven, and it's not going to be driven by paycheck and ego in terms of title. Mm-hmm. I'm definitely going to vet the person who would be my manager better and make sure that we have points of connection that are well-rounded and not just based on the position. Mm-hmm. So really my priorities have more to do with culture, have more to do with setting myself up for success with the type of manager that is going to also be a coach. And then also the type of job that I am looking for is not going to be so expansive that it just overwhelms me. But I also know that whatever position I take has to be a very relationship focused position, because I really feel that my mission in my own personal life, whether it's through writing or for art, or for work, is to connect, to collaborate, and to make people's lives better.
Mm-hmm. Well, it makes sense, especially given what you said about how you grew up and the expectations of that. And that's why you kept allowing yourself to be driven by ego and paycheck, is because that seemed like what success should look like based on how you grew up and the environment in that household. And I find it fascinating too that you are ready, and it kind of hit you now. And I wonder if that's partly because your relationship with your mother has changed a little bit, that now she's recognizing your creativity for the beauty and uniqueness that it embodies.
I'm going to make a date analogy again. So I know you've been married for a long time, and so I don't know how much this will resonate with you, but I think that it will. You know, my job that I had when Dan was my manager, it was like having the best boyfriend ever. I'm not just talking about him. I'm talking about the job, and I'm talking about the relationship we had and the success from a career perspective. And then, as you know, from me personally, I had a time in life where things got dumped upside down, where my vertebrae collapsed and a bunch of stuff happened. And it was almost like I was trying to reclaim that success, that best date, that greatest love ever in my work world. Mm-hmm. And I think that I could have it again, but it doesn't have to look the same. And I think I was trying to make it look the same.
Just like people who end up marrying another version of the same, or another person that's just the same as their previous relationship, but just in a different package. And I've known a lot of people who have done that, who have been married multiple times to the same person, even though it was a different person. And I could see that, because you really want it to work. And I think we're so committed to making something work that we can't see the pattern that we've created in our lives. And that's a big one. And it's something, when I work with my coaching clients, that we talk about a lot, is identifying those patterns and seeing where they came from, so that we can either embrace them, change them. Because not all patterns are bad. But yeah, well, that's really interesting. I really appreciate hearing that. And I think over the next few days, I'm going to still be processing a lot of what we talked about, in particular, that idea of trying to recreate something that we loved, that was so valuable, and finding ourselves beating ourselves up over it. That's definitely another story we tell ourselves. Well, this was so great, I want it again, and I can make that happen. But really, the universe has other plans for us. And sometimes we have to go with it and find our joy, find those places without trying to recreate them.
I agree 100%.
That's really interesting. I'm definitely going to be thinking about this for a little while.
Me too.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Shelley, for joining me. And just for our audience, I will be linking to some of Shelley's writing work, my favorite articles. I'll put direct links in. And please feel free to connect with Shelley on LinkedIn. Her profile will also be linked on the blog post associated with this podcast. And I'm really looking forward to seeing where this goes over the next few years, and seeing what kind of disruption you find in your career as a result of kind of opening up to that idea that you don't have to stick to that narrative anymore. Thank you so much, Shelley.
You too, Sarah.
Thank you for listening to Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Share Them Will. Please visit my website for more podcast episodes, blog posts, and information about how I can help you develop and share your stories at elkinsconsulting.com.
Now could you tell me